Velina mai ke aloha e nā pula pula mai moana nui a ke a hiki ke ia aina o nā mauli I Santa Fe. O wau no o Heidi K haulani he papa Hawaii a me hapa Diné wau. No hilo mai au, ua hānai ia wau I ka moku o ke ave a me New Mexico. No la ie mai o Ku'umakua Hine a no Coyote Canyon mai o Ku'umakua Kane. Mahalo piha loa no ko kāko'o ana mai. Ia te she'e Heidi Brandow Yanishia, Hawaiian Nishwito, Todachi Nibashichin, Hawaiian Idashichedo, Nashkali Dashinali. Hello everyone, good afternoon, friends and relatives. My name is Heidi Brandow. I am Diné and Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiian. I'm the Associate Director of Communications at First Peoples Fund. It is an honor and a privilege to welcome you to this thought-provoking collective spirit conversation panel discussion on a topic of great significance and relevance in today's ever-evolving world, Indigenous intellectual property rights. Excuse me. Presented by First Peoples Fund, whose mission is to honor and support Indigenous artists and culture bearers through grant-making initiatives, culturally rooted programming, and training and mentorship. Before we begin, I invite you to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and LinkedIn. If you haven't done so already, we also invite you to sign up for our monthly newsletter to receive important updates on opportunities, news, and events. Also, First Peoples Fund launched the Collective Spirit podcast, which features Native artists and culture bearers who discuss the power of Indigenous art and culture. Subscribe, listen, and share this podcast, now available on a majority of the streaming platforms, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, and so forth. We will provide the links in our chat. Just a moment. Oh, excuse me. I'm honored to introduce our distinguished panelists who represent a rich tapestry of Indigenous creatives from different disciplines such as design, art, and the law. Each of them brings a unique perspective and expertise to this discussion, shedding light on the significance of Indigenous viewpoints in the context of intellectual property rights. Their experiences and insights will contribute to a deeper understanding of the complex interplay between culture, creativity, and legal protections. As we engage in this dialogue, we examine the legal framework surrounding Indigenous intellectual property and explore how these rights intersect with diverse creative practices. We must recognize and respect the diverse ways Indigenous knowledge and cultural expressions manifest in the modern world. Furthermore, we'll talk about strategies and considerations for safeguarding Indigenous creative practices and communities. This includes addressing challenges Indigenous communities face in preserving their heritage, language, creative traditions, both in present and for future generations. By delving into these important topics, we aim to foster a greater understanding of the unique challenges and opportunities that our communities encounter in the realm of intellectual property. I would like to express my great gratitude to our panelists for their willingness to share their expertise and experiences, and to all of you, our audience, for your interest and engagement in this conversation. Together, we will embark on a journey of exploration and enlightenment to foster greater awareness and respect for intellectual property rights. So, I'm going to give our guests a moment to introduce themselves. Today we have Ben Calabaza, a member of the Kewa Pueblo Nation here in New Mexico, Crystal Worl, Athabascan, Tlingit, and Filipino from the great state of Alaska, and Dallin Maybee, Seneca, and Arapahoe, also a board member with First Peoples Fund. So Ben, if you'd like to give a brief introduction.
Merahopa, Kanete Tamaya Shutsumasuta Kokiwame. Hi, everybody. I'm Ben Calabaza. I'm from Santo Domingo, Pueblo. And a quick introduction. I'm also the Vice President of Creative and Marketing for iRoots Media, a native design and marketing firm that I helped establish in Santa Fe, initially in Southern California. And we've been working with communities, native communities throughout the US since 2004. So we're approaching our 20th year in business, which is exciting for us. And I'm just happy to be a part of this discussion. It's been a year of reflection in terms of how the work that we've been able to do in incorporating conversations with community as it pertains to design and elevating design using cultural iconography within marketing materials, logos, and programs and such. So that's who I am.
Great, thank you, Ben. Crystal, would you like to say a few words?
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. Kakia yukhat duasak yesh ayakhat sukahadi nakhatsiti athna daka hidi yeshit shungukhedi yadi ayakhat gonana nakhatsiti. My Tlingit name is Kakia and my English name is Crystal Rose Dementive Worl. I'm Tlingit, Athabascan, Filipino, and Yupik. On my Tlingit side, I'm from the Raven Sockeye clan. I currently live in Juneau, Alaska as a full-time artist and a co-owner of Trickster Company with my brother Rico. And we are an innovative Indigenous graphic design and art gift shop located online. Thank you for having me here. I'm excited for this conversation. Thank you, Heidi.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Crystal. And Dallin, if you'd like to just say a few words.
Yeah, sure. Great. Thank you so much, Heidi and First Peoples Fund, for inviting me to say a few things about the always intriguing art topic of intellectual property. It's not the sexiest area of law, but it gets pretty juicy if you really dive into concepts of ownership, especially for our people. But I am Northern Arapahoe in Seneca. I grew up on Cattaraugus territory in Western New York. Kind of relocated out west for school, got an undergrad degree in philosophy and American Indian Studies, did some master's work, and then ended up in law school with an emphasis in federal Indian law. I'm an artist. I do some traditional mediums like beadwork. I kind of got my start creating outfits for, intertribal social dancing and powwows, and then started showing at a few art shows. And after law school, I kind of landed at the Southwestern Association for Indian Arts for a time, temporarily. Well, first as a board member, and then temporarily as a director, and then permanently as chief operating officer. So I got to see some of the nuts and bolts of contemporary fine art. After that, I ended up returning to the law. I currently work for the Native American Rights Fund. I'm the assistant director of development, and I've been there about 5 years. Yeah, I'll turn it back over to Heidi.
We do have a question, and I'm also curious, are you all able to also join with your cameras, or?
It just said that the host has disabled the camera.
Oh, sorry. Let's see. Let me see if I can adjust that. Hang on one second.
Okay. Oh, there we go.
Okay, great. I'm sorry, guys. I wasn't sure. I didn't know that was the thing.
Better, right?
Yay! Well, thanks for your brief introductions, and all of you were invited intentionally because I really feel like you all bring such a unique perspective in terms of understanding, what intellectual property means, and of course your different practices have engaged in the topic in a variety of different ways. And so I think for our general audience, which we serve native artists and culture bearers, as well as various institutions and so forth. I think a lot of people are encountering these types of issues in their own professional and personal or community practices. So I thought a good place to start is to just kind of talk a little bit about the definition. Um, I'll begin by just saying that, let's see, intellectual property rights was developed in response to Western intellectual property laws. It has been promoted by organizations like the World Intellectual Property Organization, the United Nations, to help protect Indigenous intangible cultural heritage, which is not adequately covered by Western legal frameworks. Indigenous knowledge, including information about land, traditions, and oral histories, is crucial to Indigenous cultural heritage. And this knowledge is passed down through generations and plays a significant role in communal identity. Indigenous intellectual property rights encompass legal protections for specific cultural knowledge, visual arts, literature, performing arts, science, and traditional medicines within Indigenous communities. And I know that the Native American Rights Fund, of which Dallin is a part of, has also done some work in this area. So I thought we'd go ahead and start there and talk about, what are some examples of how your practices have engaged with intellectual property rights and our communities or Native populations.
Is there somebody specifically you wanted to kick off?
No, Dallin, if you'd like, just because I had just also referenced NARF, and maybe you can have some specific, like talking points related to that.
Sure. So, as an artist and as an organization, I think, we all at some point or another have to broach subjects like, cultural appropriation. What do concepts of ownership mean as an individual artist, as a tribal member, and who can really own things like design elements from different tribes? Who gets to have the right to protect some of those things? And I think that's really where the work, the World Intellectual Property Organization work that NARF does is a great place to launch into a conversation like this. As you mentioned, copyright is just simply a legal term that can be used to protect things that artists generate, creativity of the mind, right? Literary, artistic works, things like books and music and sculpture, things like that. Trademarks a little different, patent protections are a little different. But again, that intersection of Indigenous art and design and how do we protect that cultural knowledge base is really where NARF's intellectual property work starts. Back in 2007-ish, that United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Rights was really the foundation for a framework that serves to protect the sovereignty of Indigenous groups, our knowledge, our culture, and our self-determination abilities. That particular document basically places us at the table in a place where before we were very marginalized, and various governments have attempted to assimilate us. But that really is the starting point for a recognition of international rights and hopefully domestic rights here in the United States. And there's a reason why the US, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, countries with very strong Indigenous populations were some of the last signers of this particular document at the UN. But it's an appropriate place to start because within that document, things like, a recognition that tribes do have ownership over our genetic materials, over our traditional knowledge, over our cultural knowledge, over our creative expressions, all those things that we have stewarded effectively for thousands of generations, can be recognized in a place like the UN. And so NARF, along with CU Boulder, we have a project called the Implementation Project, and that really is an effort to implement some of these concepts within even our own tribes, to get tribes to pass resolutions that recognize, we call it UNDRIP for short, that Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as all those concepts. When we recognize those documents, then we can actually use that document as a mechanism to kind of leverage the United States or wherever our Indigenous peoples are to also recognize those documents. So we can start including some of that language into our casework, litigation programs, even within our relationships with our respective states that are our neighbors. That is all moving towards overall implementation. I kind of want to leave it right there because this is one of those subjects where you can really go into a few different rabbit holes, and we got to leave some time for a pretty all-around conversation. But we'll just kind of start there, I think.
Yeah, thank you for providing additional context. And I think that you covered a lot of bases in terms of sort of the overall idea. I'm also wondering too, like, of course, a lot of the people that we serve and as an organization are artists, and they might not have generally an idea or sort of information on what considerations Native artists use, or what they should consider when using or applying cultural motifs and imagery to art pieces, design production, and so forth. How might a Native artist consider intellectual property rights when applied to their creative practice? Crystal, I know that you've had a lot of engagement sort of on a local, but also on a sort of a large scale projects, like working more nationally or internationally with companies and so forth. What are some considerations that you in your practice have had to employ in terms of intellectual property rights?
Yeah, I think it's important to, one, know where I come from, who I am, and have a clear understanding of intellectual property as it applies to Tlingit law. And I feel that this applies to, various different tribes, but as a Tlingit artist, it's important to pay attention to the designs that I'm working on, that I'm studying and recreating, because a lot of the stories, the designs, songs, and dances belong to certain clans. I'm from the Fukahadi clan, the Raven Sakai clan, and so there are some songs and stories that I can depict through my art. But it's, again, they're not, let's say it is from my clan. It doesn't necessarily mean that I have rights to sell it, but I can tell the story and share it to a certain extent. And so another example is I'm a Shungu Katie Yeti. So I'm a grandchild of a Thunderbird. And there are stories from my father's clan and my grandmother's clan from the Thunderbird, the Shungu Katie. They have incredible stories, but I need permission to retell those stories. And I most definitely, when I create a design, I just keep my hands off of clan crests and designs that are owned by particular clans, unless I'm approached by that clan, which happens often. An opposite clan may ask me to design something for regalia or a new drum for them. But generally, when I'm creating designs, I used universal designs that are not clan property. Just looking at it from a legal perspective from Tlingit law. And then there's also like the Western world of protecting our artwork. And so when I, it's a big issue in Alaska, in particular Southeast Alaska, with the type of design I do is called form line design, which is specific to Pacific Northwest Coast tribes, Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian. And if you come downtown Juneau, you'll see a lot of shops downtown that are owned by the cruise ships mostly, or seasonal companies. And it's completely legal, but they will take native designs and replicate them overseas and mass produce them and then sell them in their shop and label them as native art. And we've had some, issues with the silver hand and the the process of making our art identified as authentic. There's various things as an artist I can register, through my corporation, through my village as a certified artist. But again, not every artist does that, and it's a bit complex. So it's a part of my job as an artist and a co-owner of Trickster Company. Is we're a brand that sells and promotes Indigenous design on various products that we produce in Alaska. And so, we get approached a lot with the question of cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. And so another big part of being part of the Trickster Company team is sharing our story, our art, and, essentially informing and teaching people about how to be good allies, but also how to rep native gear made by native artists and not how to identify knockoff native art, and what to do to report it. We've had cases locally here in Juneau where there was a shop trying to get away with it and they got in trouble legally with selling authentic native art. But once you recognize it, it's very obvious to spot it out.
And I know like some of the work that you've done as well, Ben, you've also kind of engaged in these conversations. And I'm really glad that you talk about Crystal, by the way. This problem with like non-natives reproducing mass quantities of designs that are from your community and how problematic that could be. But I think you've also shared sort of similar or engaged in those kind of conversations too, right, Ben? Or are there other parts of this question or this experience that you could shed light on?
So a majority of the work that we do is with Native organizations or Native communities. And a big part of what our process includes is understanding, similar to what Crystal mentioned, these community responsibilities of acknowledging that design serves as almost communal property, maybe more so in regional groups. So for myself, the Pueblo communities, one example, right, is our own state flag with the Zia symbol and its appropriation and misuse that's continually happening. And I think it just comes more with the territory of appropriation and how designs have been taken from numerous communities to benefit for-profit organizations. And so a big part of what we do is take into community ownership as a part of our process. So before working and creating a design is to ask those questions of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate specifically for communities that I'm not familiar with, right? That are within New Mexico. I think I have a pretty good understanding of what can be used with design. And a big part of what we're able to do is allow those communities and organizations we work with to control those designs after creation. So most of the work that we've created for communities and Native organizations ultimately are usually not selling those designs for profit, right? It's more or less being able to get a hand on a cool t-shirt, right? Because it's a part of a fun run that you happen to be a part of in a community, or swag, right, at a conference that you're able to get your hands on. So I think there's a difference between maybe the work that an artist might do, or an organization like Crystal's might produce, than the work that I do. So ultimately, I think the framework that I come from is, as I mentioned from the very beginning, is making sure that artists or even illustrators that we've worked with in the past pause and really think about what they're creating before we move it into a space that may not belong in that space, right? Moving a design that might be intended for textile work, or say pottery or basketry, that it doesn't belong on a certain product, right? And so those are just some general questions that I think as folks start to create for organizations or artists that are on this call, is to kind of take a moment to reflect on what the possibilities are in terms of moving the work that you're creating, and making sure that you have, as Crystal mentioned, right, authority or permission, especially if you're working for a community that you're not familiar with, so that one, you're not getting yourself into a legal situation of producing something, and it's just best practice, I would say, of making sure that you have sort of an understanding of the design and its purpose. Maybe not the full story of why it exists, but more so how to respect the design for its use.
Great, thank you so much. I'm wondering if you could just share a little bit about how those community conversations, what they look like. Like, how does one begin the process of asking for permission? Like, and I know this is sort of like a case by case situation, right? Like, what might apply for Crystal's community might not apply necessarily for the Navajo Nation and so forth. But I'm wondering, just through your experience of, um, as a creative working in this area, like, what does that process look like for you?
Yeah,
And
so a good,
also, sorry, one
go.
other thing, has the outcome always been that it's like the green light, like you just got approval, or and what do you do if there is an approval?
Yeah, so I would say we have more green lights than we do red lights. um, One good example would be working with the Santa Fe Indian School, the Leadership Institute with Colonel Chosa, and at the time, Governor Brian Vial from Acoma um, brought on our company to produce a logo for a public convocation, right? A conference that was brought together twice so far, bringing together all the communities across New Mexico, public communities. So attendance, like over 500 people. But what really they were looking for is a design that would, in a sense, create unity among us all, and also create and maybe elevate design. And a big part of what was involved in this process was having a community leader, right, and also a school leader at the table with myself and an artist. I'm thinking about, how do we not just replicate a design, but how do we elevate a design? And I think that's where you start to move into different space in terms of what I've had the privilege of being able to teach at the Institute of American Indian Arts, in some of the classes that I was able to teach there, of thinking about design in terms of using what our ancestors have given us, the ability to observe and maybe use as inspiration, but how do we turn those designs into more contemporary conversations or stories, right? Because we are a contemporary people. So how do we use that as a foundation, but redesign those elements to reflect our observations of our environment, right? So thinking about how might we take, just as an example, since I've mentioned the sun symbol, what would my interpretation of that be in terms of what the meaning behind that represents? But allowing myself to be an artist, right, and create, because I think those symbols, of course, were created by we wouldn't call them artists, right, but people who had that ability to create symbols like clouds and rain and landscapes. And so having that, I guess, general understanding in creating newer design elements, having those folks at the table allowed us to avoid any sort of issues that might come across when presenting this design on a larger scale to a larger community. And so, one, there was the support of community leadership, right? From if you would think about it in terms of a government standpoint of a sovereign nation. And so it was easier to present a design that incorporated motifs from Pueblo design. And I think what happened at the conference was a sort of a celebration of how design could be represented in this modern context while using the foundation of what ancestral design and iconography looks like. So I hope that answers your question. In terms of like, so we'll stop in terms of maybe going into a path where the design is not headed and representing the community appropriately. Then it's just back to asking, okay, well, what is something that might become a little more accessible, I guess, to folks? So it's a challenge, you know, and a balancing act, of course, of easily replicating versus innovating, you know. So that would be my response.
Crystal or Dallin, did you want to contribute?
Yeah, I've got a few thoughts. I think that you touched on it earlier. The appropriate place to really begin to have these conversations is as a community, to get together with your elected leaders and the community artists and culture bearers to decide what is, as Crystal mentioned, something that's owned by the tribe or by a specific clan, what is, as Ben mentions, what is appropriate for some of these narratives, but to still have the creative license to evolve and grow in our own narratives. That's one of the beauties of our art forms, is even utilitarian objects can become very high level fine art because of that artistic expression, that ability to talk about the world that we see around us. And so when you have these conversations with your leadership, you know, you really should think about protecting even the name of your tribe without some of those copyright. And yes, it's within a Western legal framework, but that's just one of the realities we're in right now. Until we are truly sovereign, until we've truly severed that guardian-ward relationship, it is a mechanism to protect our sovereignty. NARF engages in a lot of work to not only protect our sovereignty, but to defend against encroachments to it, to assert our sovereignty, to make sure that we are on this path of self-determination, even with our art. And so the community can come together and say, hey, you know, yes, let's implement, let's pass a resolution to not only adopt documents like UNDRIP, but to start thinking about how we can protect our art forms, our culture, these cultural expressions, because we absolutely have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop all those forms and mechanisms of cultural heritage. But the tribe's got to start talking about it. Why don't we have an intellectual property resolution or an intellectual property committee within the tribe, much like we have an education committee or an education office, much like we have a health services office? Let's have one that gets together and as a mechanism of cultural self-determination to protect our design elements, to protect even our own name and our concepts for ourselves. We actually have, you know, some of our attorneys, Sue Noe is doing a lot of this international work. She's doing a fantastic job at NARF. But they've developed toolkits that can take you topic by topic that talk about this exact thing. How you can approach it as a community, how you can implement UNDRIP, and how it can become another tool for your legal advocates to assert that self-determination and sovereignty. So, go to our website, www.narf.org, and just look up our WIPO work, our World Intellectual Property Org work, and it'll pull up all kinds of documents and this specific toolkit that you can use. There was a relatively recent victory just last month where the United States Patent and Trademark Office published a notice saying that they're going to start formally engaging with the World Intellectual Property Organization in consultations with tribes to talk about what this consultation process looks like. How can tribes best protect themselves, their cultural expressions, their cultural knowledge, in not only this international framework, but domestically? It's a huge step forward. We couldn't even get the U.S. to adopt UNDRIP, 20 years ago. And here we are, the Trademark Office taking steps to consult with tribes in a way that is a lot more meaningful and will be a lot more impactful to protecting things like our cultural arts. So go and check out those toolkits, talk to your tribal leaders, become a tribal leader with that background in art, creativity in the thought process, and that critical thought process to advance your tribal interests is increasingly more important. I'm at NCA right now, and I love seeing some of my art contemporaries there on council and on tribal leadership that are doing exactly that, talking about these tough conversations and having these challenging conversations, but it all advances sovereignty, and we can do that with our art as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Dallin. I guess another question I want to bring forth is what role can non-Indigenous individuals and institutions play in supporting and respecting Indigenous intellectual property rights? Are there best practices for collaboration and engagement? And I think you all have touched upon what those types of conversations can look like and why they should happen. But is there more that you think non-Native institutions should be proactive about when considering Indigenous intellectual property rights and or collaborating with Native creatives?
I'll just jump right in. I would like to. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, sure, you can.
So a lot of my contract work that I do, I'm not sure if it will let me. Let's see, are you able to see my screen now?
No, I can't see it. If you want to send it over too, I can, but it looks like you have co-hosting abilities, so.
Yeah. Well, a lot of my design work, I get commissioned or contracted a lot to design things that are for the public space and or things for non-Indigenous owned brands and companies. And I think one thing that's that I really try to put energy and time into when I get a contract with someone is that I include time for consultation with my client, and that basically is to inform them who I am, where I'm from, how I work as an artist, but also how they should expect to work and collaborate with an Indigenous artist. And I'd say 99% of the time, my clients are very they've never worked with an Indigenous artist before, but they're moving towards the trend of hiring and working and collaborating with an Indigenous artist, even though some of the brands may have had a history of appropriating Native art, it's becoming a trend to engage Native people more so in the arts. So one thing that I'm working on right now is, for example, with Weston skis and snowboards, and smart wool socks. I did some form line designs of salmon for them, and part of beginning working with them was explaining to them the art, what is form line, um, what is my relationship. The theme was salmon and the environment. Um, and I had to spend, time explaining the connections between Native people and the environment versus, environmentalists that are non-Native and their relationship to the land. Because 1% of the proceeds of the snowboards and skis go back to 1% of the planet, which I had to go and enroll the Yukon River Drainage Fisheries Association. They're a nonprofit at home that helps research salmon return where my family's from in the interior, because there's been very low count of salmon. And so I had to basically explain how supporting Native people being subsistent is supporting the environment. And I also had to explain, like the designs that I'm using are more universal imagery of salmon. They're not, my clan crest is of a sockeye and it's arched and it's inside of this ovoid. So I'm not using that particular design, but I am using salmon and recreating that design in a way that's not, taking from anyone's clan without permission. I also work closely with other artists and peers. I think it's really important to be curious and ask questions and not be afraid to ask questions from one another, especially those of you who are wanting to learn how to be better allies and how to collaborate with Indigenous people. I think questions are good. Like they do get a little bit exhausting sometimes, but it's important to be curious and how you can support Native people, and also collaborate with Native people. If you want a Native design on a blanket and you really like Raven's Tail design, you should research where does Raven's Tail design come from, who's the Raven's Tail weaver, and reach out to them how they can collaborate with you, or how you can commission and hire them to create a design that can be used for your project. If you're producing something, I think in 2020 the brand Neiman Marcus had taken a Raven's Tail design that was almost like exactly identical to Chilkat weaver Clarissa Rizal, her design, and they put it on a robe and then they sold it for about over $2,500 on Neiman Marcus and titled it Raven's Tail robe. So that was like a direct infringement on copyright and Tlingit law. And they were Sealaska Heritage Institute and her family descendants filed a lawsuit, and won that lawsuit against Neiman Marcus. So that's a really bad example of taking without permission, because they never reached out. They supposedly found it on the internet and saw her work and took it. And so it's the lack of connecting and communicating with Indigenous people. And it's like the history of taking what is not theirs to be taken from the beginning. So, and in Juneau, it's a struggle because it's it's still very common to have knockoff native art is sold everywhere, and legally they can't label it as authentic native art, so that's illegal now, but they can still sell it and replicate it as long as it's not promoted as native art, and they have to put a label on it if it's made in China or Bollywood or wherever. Um, and that's still very damaging to native artists because we work very hard to create things from our hands, and a lot, I learned the art from a lifetime of mentorship with my mentors, and it's really degrading to walk into a store and see someone selling a really, really bad design that's really poorly done and like poorly made on a t-shirt, or it's like a shot glass or something ridiculous, and see it for sale for $2, where I have invested so much time in my process, and to sell something, if I sell a painting for $2,000, it's like there's decades of training and time put into that piece. Um, and it's really shocking to see, like a postcard with the same design on it when someone takes it without my permission, or they make a new design that's supposedly formline, but it's not. It's really bad. It's like cringing. So I think that one of the most important thing is to be curious. Two is ask questions from your peers and other artists. Reach out to native, engage with those communities where that design comes from, um, and ask how you can collaborate. I have, because I work for a lot of non-native owned brands and collaborate with them, and I actually really enjoy it. And most of them haven't worked with native artists before, and it's really a pleasure to work with people that are curious and want to engage of how to collaborate with me. It's a cool opportunity, and I really try to set a platform. This is how I work, and this is how you should expect to work with Indigenous artists, is just being open and listening, and understanding there are some areas that are we can't do that design, or we can't do that. And I try to be very assertive, like, yes, you can promote me and my work, but please, check in with me with words that are used as well. So we're not, when we promote a new product that comes out, that brand is not making me feel like I'm romanticized, or, like, I want them to collaborate with me on every step of the way, not just the design, but at the promotion of a piece, how the story is told, the words that are used. Um, and so it's just it requires a lot more engagement working with community members, and it's just more work, and that's the way it is.
I don't know if you remember, Crystal, but when you were still at I remember we worked with you illustrating a design for the College Horizons organization. It was just like a banner that they were going to use to promote the recruitment of Alaskan Native students. I don't know if you remember that design you did.
Yeah, it probably needs to be updated.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Crystal. I think that those are all really like super. I think you nailed a lot of the points that non-native individuals and institutions, companies, and so forth, if they are truly invested or interested in working with native artists and designers, and that it's a process, right? That it's this, and that they, you can't just be like a couple fingers in the door type of commitment. It's like you have to fully commit, and then it's really cool to hear about these sort of best practices that you've established in working with and engaging with non-native institutions. So we're kind of running out of time, but I want to provide our audience the opportunity to ask any questions that they might have, but also provide our panelists the chance to touch upon any additional key points that you want to bring up as we kind of wind things down. we are kind of just barely like touching the surface of this topic. There's a lot of things going on, even internally within Native communities. I was reminded when y'all were talking about like, there was all this, we see this all the time on social media, other Native designers or fashion lines will have their own sort of internal feuds with other Native artists, and it's all related to like intellectual property. So we see these kind of things kind of like unfolding even within our own communities, but also, the real serious conversation about language preservation and language within Native communities, and how some companies have taken the liberty of basically like owning the copyright, if you will, or intellectual property of language and language systems. So, like I said, yeah, we were just barely touching the surface. But if there's anything else that you'd like to add, and if there are any questions, we welcome you to feel free to share that now.
I just got a real quick thing. I inevitably get asked about, how does an artist go about obtaining a copyright or a trademark for their goods? And it's a relatively straightforward process. If you want to go through the U.S. Process, you can go online. There's an application process. They kind of walk you through it. It's a small fee. But don't be that guy or gal that goes and copyrights all the intellectual property of the tribe as a whole, because then you're just setting yourself up for all kinds of big trouble. But encourage your tribe to do it first. Absolutely, start getting some trademarks on those things, because when people are filing their own copyrights for appropriated things, they'll come across some of those trademarks and copyrights and realize, oh, hey, we've got a fight on our hands. So, if as tribes get more savvy to this process and engage in these litigations against appropriators, then hopefully we'll kind of nip some of these things in the bud. But
Well, any closing remarks, any last statements, Crystal or Ben? It's all good if you don't. I just want to thank all of you for attending, our attendees and also our panelists today. For those that may have arrived a little bit later, I'm going to go ahead and repost all of our links. We invite you to continue to follow us, to subscribe to our newsletter, listen to our podcast, follow us on social media and so forth. But more importantly, follow the work of Ben Calabaza, Crystal Worl, and Dallin Maybee. Their links have been provided in the chat as well, because they're all out there doing incredible work, and we're really appreciative of their time and expertise on this topic, as I'm sure we could talk about many other things. Here, let me just provide the Native American Rights Fund's link as well, where you can also look up the WIPO toolkit. And if y'all are interested or you have specific questions, feel free to reach out. I'm also providing Dallin's email address in the chat. So thank you all for your time, and we look forward to having you join us for another conversation, which will probably be happening this coming spring 2024. So thank you all. Have a great holiday and happy Native American Heritage Month.
Thank you, guys.
Bye, everyone.